I was just thinking of a topic that would let us, as I say, talk about Doctor Who in a very positive sort of way. I did want to get back and get in depth to a bit of classic after doing a lot of New Who, just to balance the show out a little bit. And I just thought, we talk about doctors, we talk about companions, and I thought, but we don't always talk about these other people, particularly somebody like Terrance Dicks. And I mean, Doctor Who fandom, I think, is particularly strong in inspiring writers and inspiring creatives, and in acknowledging and respecting the writers and creatives. I think that when you ask Doctor Who fans about who are the real heroes of the show, absolutely you get Tom Baker, you get William Hartnell, you get David Tennant. The next sort of lines are people like Verity Lambert, Russell T Davies. But there is a layer there which is David Whittaker, Robert Holmes, Andrew Cartmell. And Terrance Dicks is one of the giants of that field. And the more we started to plan this podcast, I think the more we just really sort of realised just what a massive part of the show this guy is. And I don't know that there's any Doctor Who fan out there that doesn't have some fondness for something, at least, that Terrance has done.
Oh, yeah. As long as they've been watching the classic series in some way, I'd say.
Oh, for sure. And look, I acknowledge we are talking classic here, although he has had a role, as we'll talk about later on, even with the new series.
Oh, yeah, we'll definitely get to that. And I'll make the point here, you say we don't look at, the writers and behind-the-scenes people as much, and it is 12 months since we did our Stephen Moffat retrospective. And in that time since, I don't think we've really concentrated on a writer. And it's interesting that I'd say Terrance Dicks is probably like the well to which Stephen Moffat would go to in his early days. That's who he would have been reading. That's who he would have been, maybe trying to emulate as a child, like many children out there were back in the 70s. I want to write Doctor Who like Terrance Dicks, and reading Target novels and such on the beach. Isn't there that famous picture of Moffat reading a Target novel on the beach? Although it might be one of the early Daleks books, so probably not a Terrance book, but you know what I mean? He's just inspired so many people, including people like Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies,
Yep. Gary Russell is one that I've seen in person, interviewed on stage, where he has said when he was first asked to do a Doctor Who novelisation, in that case of the telemovie, his first thought was, okay, how would Terrance Dicks do this?
And that's a great way to come at it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go through Terrance's involvement with Doctor Who. Look, we could talk about his involvement outside of Doctor Who, but in the space we've got, even just a brief overview of Doctor Who's going to be a struggle.
Oh, yeah, look him up on YouTube. Not on YouTube, on Wikipedia, I'm sorry. And just look at his non-Doctor Who work. He has written so much stuff. It's incredible.
Yes, and produced stuff and script-edited stuff. And, yeah, an amazingly prodigious career. Amazingly successful.
Yeah.
But he did start off in Doctor Who back in the Troughton era. And as he calls it, uncredited, barely paid deputy assistant script editor.
These are the pictures you see in Doctor Who reference books where he's there. He looks like a young Paul McCartney to me, Dave. He's got the moustache, the Sgt. Pepper's moustache, and a bowl-cut haircut, and he's quite young and fit. He looks like one of the Beatles in these pictures. Yeah,
he's very much of his time, often smoking the pipe.
Yeah.
And yeah, just this writer who'd been involved with script writing, particularly on soaps, doing advertising work, but then he finds himself in the Doctor Who office. Now, I'm going to reference a few times in this chat, Rob, the time when I saw Terrance Dicks and met him and saw him interviewed at a convention out here.
Oh, brilliant.
And one of the things that he said when asked about his time in that office was he said just how dysfunctional he actually found this office, how unprofessional he found this office. He as a young, inspired, up-and-coming, wanting to make his mark writer, and he sort of found all the old guard of the BBC going to lunch at 12 o'clock at the pub and sort of not coming back till 4, and really sort of seeing Doctor Who as a bit of a tired series in some ways, until he starts to form that relationship with Derek Sherwin and get more involved. But of course, famously, this is the time when Terrance discovered Robert Holmes.
Yes. Now, it's just interesting to talk of it as a tired old series, because I guess at this point, it's 6 years old or so.
It's doing its 6th series, yeah.
Yeah, and they'd be looking at that and comparing it to other shows, I guess, that were out there and thinking, God, this has been dragging on a bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm not going to make my career here. Let's just get it turned, turn the thing out and let's go to lunch sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
But it was that time where you had Bryant and Lloyd and Sherwin and Dicks all sort of shuffling chairs and literally different producer, script editor combinations on almost every season, almost every story of that season. I mean, it is a tumultuous time in the Doctor Who office.
Oh, yeah, people think the start of the Davo era is interesting, with Bidmead in and Root and then Saywood. but this is much more beyond that, with the way it chops and changes.
Yeah, and Terrance really does make his mark in that environment, because he is the up-and-coming, up-and-thrusting writer. He discovers Robert Holmes and works up the Crotons as an emergency story, and then suddenly the prisoner in space embarrassment falls apart. And so they're making a story that he's basically commissioned and discovered. He has a large job effectively rewriting large parts of the Seeds of Death, and that works really well. And then suddenly they're turning to him and saying, we need 10 episodes to finish the series. We've got nothing. Terrance, here's a pen and a piece of paper. Come back with a story. And famously, he sits down with his old mentor, Mac Hulk, and puts together a cracking 10-episode story of the War Games.
Yeah. God, I mean, what a daunting task. Although, conversely, his novelisation of it is wafer thin. How does that work?
That is true. But yeah, just to be told, you can have one location filming shot. You can have a couple of sets, a limited number of actors. It needs to be done by tomorrow. We need to turn out episode 1 in a week. And by the way, you need to write out Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines and Wendy Padbury at the end of it. And we don't know who the new Doctor is, so could he leave it on a cliffhanger for us?
And on top of all that, he introduces the Time Lords.
Yes, and that's something we will be talking about. But yeah, I think that it's important to remember that we think about Terrance Dicks being very much part of the Let's Dicks era, and of course he is. But a lot of season 6, particularly that back end, that doesn't happen without him.
Oh, absolutely. As you say, it's an era where people do forget he was involved. I think just because his later work overshadows it. But it can't be understated what he did here, particularly the War Games. My God.
Yeah, and look, Seeds of Death is one that I'm really fond of as well, and he pulled that together, and yeah, really important. But off the back of that, of course, he does become the script editor for Doctor Who for what we now know as the Pertwee era.
Wasn't TV good in those days? You could just show up and bang out some stories, and within a year or two, you were the script editor for a series. Just wonderful.
Well, and maybe, again, it just shows where the BBC was at, because rather than saying, okay, this is our flagship show and we need to go get our best talent to work on it, they're like, that young guy over there, he's keen, isn't he? Do you want to be the script editor, Terrance? Cool, you're hired. There really is that feeling. And famously, season 7 could have been the last series.
Yeah. But, that sort of vibe is continuing, I think, when Andrew Cartmel takes over. It's like, oh, you're a young up-and-coming guy. Do you want to have a go? Sure, yeah. Why not?
Yeah, no, it's really effective.
Yeah.
And it's really, really positive. But what I want to talk about in this little bit here is, famously, I mean, Terrance is a wonderful raconteur. He's been interviewed on many DVDs and in many articles. He loves chatting about his time, and as does Barry Letts. But he consistently says, when he's asked about the Pertwee year, he says, well, we started off with the show that Derek Sherwin wanted to make, and Derek had a lot of very strong ideas, all of them bad.
I love the way he talks.
Yeah, he's such a wonderful storyteller, and he's clearly exaggerating for humorous effect.
Yes.
But Terrance was not a fan of let's exile the Doctor to Earth. He was not a fan of let's introduce Unit. Although he respected and liked Carol and John, he was not a fan of the Liz Shaw character. Yet he turns out 4 fantastically good stories anyway.
Well, that's the mark of a professional, isn't it?
It is, and one of the things that I think is really interesting with a script editor is looking at the team of writers that they put together. Cartmel, I think the biggest thing and the best thing he ever did for Doctor Who was his ability to take a very empty cupboard and find Stephen Wyatt, Rona Munro, Ben Aronovich, Ian Briggs, wonderful writers, and bring them together and actually create a way, in a way that someone like Eric Saywood I don't think ever really achieved. You don't look at the writers that Eric Saywood brought into Doctor Who and go, wow, what a collection.
No, not at all.
Whereas Terrance, the first thing he does is he gets Robert Holmes back, and that's a brilliant decision. He gets Mac Hulk back regularly, brilliant decision. He brings Don Horton in to write for the series. He gets David Whittaker back. Like if you're going to write, if you've got 4 slots to fill in the season, Holmes, Hulk, Whittaker, and Horton, that's a pretty good lineup.
It's hard to top.
Yeah, and then he brings the Bristol boys in as regular contributors to Doctor Who. And look, I agree with some fans that their output is a bit variable, but they're very, very solid writers. He brings in a number of people, but he gets this reliable thing. Every year you're going to have a script by Robert Holmes and it'll be great. Yeah. Every year you'll have a script by Malcolm Hulke about giant lizards and it'll be great. You get a couple of Don Hortons in there. That it's just this wonderful... Robert Sloman is brought into it and he works with Barry Letts.
Yeah.
Terrance Dicks really creates this wonderful cast of writers that really sets the show up.
And do you think Dave creates a very stable era, particularly after an era where he said, it was a bit of a shambles?
Oh, without doubt. He's the script editor for 5 years. Letts is the producer for 5 years. They clearly, up until Letts' death, were still the best of friends. And they clearly got on really well with John Pertwee. They got on with Katie Manning when she was cast. They really seem to have enjoyed doing this. But, stable behind the camera, stable in front of the camera. And it shows because the Pertwee era starts well, but it grows as an era. It just gets better and better. And there's so much good in it, and Pertwee evolves into the role, and the unit family grows up around them, and this reliable television in a way that, look, I love the 60s, but reliable is not a word you'd use about that era of Doctor Who.
No, not at all.
But yes, as I said, you then see Terrance Dicks going, okay, well, Derek Sherwin's laid down this track, I'm going to be professional, make the best of it, but then I'm going to start to turn it around and make the series that he and Barry Letts want to make. So Liz Shaw is out, Joe Grant is in, and they basically create the Doctor companion team that we still think of as being the definitive template of Doctor Who.
Oh, without doubt. Yeah.
We think about now the show as being the Doctor who travels with a young lady assistant, and that's sort of the template. It's broken from time to time, and they throw different things in there. But even when the new series is brought back, it's Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper. It's Matt Smith and Karen Gillan. They're the combinations that you think about, and that's what we think about the series being. They really set that back up. They move it away from Earth. So in season 8 you have one series where the TARDIS leaves Earth, and then in series 9 you have a couple, and then in series 10 he gets his dematerialization circuit back, and they go off and have adventures again.
Which is quite a change from all of the 60s having 2 or 3 companions at any one time.
Yeah, it really is. And again, they continue that when Katie Manning leaves with bringing Liz Sladen on. Yeah. And again, this is something else that they do. Look at who they cast in front of the camera. Okay, they inherited John Pertwee, but they cast Katie Manning. They cast Liz Sladen. They cast Tom Baker. Yeah. They cast Ian Marter.
Yeah.
That's a pretty impressive thing to be able to say you did. They invent the Master.
Yeah. It's such a strong era behind the camera with these guys.
And behind the scenes as well, they're really developing Doctor Who lore. I think that with the possible exception of David Whittaker, Terrance Dicks is the first person who actually sits down and, although you wouldn't call it a showrunner's Bible like you would today, he actually has that thing of, okay, this is what Doctor Who's done in the past, and this is who he's met in the past, and this is what we know, and then he starts to add to that. So we've now met the Time Lords, and this is what the Time Lords do, and they come from Gallifrey, and they have a High Council, and they have regenerations, and we have the idea that the Doctor has a mentor, and then in his final episode we meet his mentor. All of this sort of stuff laid out, and for the first time there's a real vision of the show as a cohesive narrative.
Absolutely. And although the Time Lords will get, changed around a bit, famously by the time of Deadly Assassin, they're portrayed in quite a different way to how they're first portrayed on screen. Just bringing in this concept of the Time Lords. It's hard for people, I guess, to grasp that for the first couple of Doctors, right until Troughton's last story, We didn't know he was a Time Lord. You know, viewers didn't know he was a Time Lord. I should say we weren't watching at the time, Dave.
No. But yeah, he's the first one that uses the words Time Lord in a script. He's the first one that takes them to the Doctor's home planet. It's in one of the shows that he script edits that Gallifrey is a word that is first used. He works with Bob Baker and Dave Martin, creates Omega. Regeneration, I mean, he's the one that basically, with the Barry Letts, sets up the rules for regeneration. Again, something that we take for granted, but the word regeneration I don't think is used until Planet of the Spiders.
No, the Doctor was certainly renewing himself, but it wasn't called regeneration on screen. Yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, I mean, let's be honest here. Terrance Dicks is fantastic, but Terrance Dicks with Barry Letts is phenomenal.
Oh, killer combo. Just fantastic.
And I love listening to the stories that they tell about how they would sort of work with each other and with directors. So Terrance would come in and he'd have to script edit, and it was his job to make it cheaper to make, and then Barry would say, oh, hang on, well, we can afford to do this, or a director would then go and say, well, we'll overspend here and we'll do this, and Terrance was like, no, we have to bring it back, and they work together. And there's one thing that I think Terrance has said about that time that really struck me, and he was critiquing, not in a nasty way, but just in an interesting way, the process of writing the show now, where he says that no writer's script gets better after 2 drafts.
Yeah, very wise.
And so, what he would do, he'll discuss the story with a writer, they'll work out the basic blocks of it, and he'll commission it. The writer would go away and write a first draft. He would then come in, he'd have a look, he'd call the writer in and go, okay, look, you've got too many sets, so you say you want a meeting room and a communications room, well, they can be the same room, and you have too many characters, so we'll merge those characters there, and I think that it's a bit flabby in episode 3, but there's not enough excitement in episode 4, all of those sort of things, they'll work it out. He'll say, go away and do me another draft. And then the writer would come back with their best possible draft, and as far as he was concerned at that point, that was the writer done. They'd done the best they could do, and it was not going to get better saying do a 3rd draft, a 4th draft, a 5th draft. So it was his job to then take it and make it work. And now that just might mean, putting a bit of spicy dialogue in, or padding the odd episode out to 25 minutes, by writing his famous quarrel scenes. Or it could be rewriting the thing from scratch. But yeah, like when he talks about hearing that Rob Shearman did, something like 40,000 drafts of Dalek, he just says, how is that a good creative process? You can't get the writer to be better 43 times.
Precisely. They've just got to give it up and let someone else take a look eventually. 2 is probably enough, yeah.
Yeah.
So, Dave, the Pertwee era goes on for 5 happy seasons, but then when it comes time for Pertwee to leave, it's time to appoint a new Doctor. This is a big moment for any showrunner or any producer, script editor combo, and look at who they got. Tom Baker. Yeah,
I was thinking about this earlier today, Rob. Is there a better handover between both the on and off-screen teams than there was from the Pertwee, Letts, Dicks era to the Baker, Hinchcliffe, Holmes era?
I can't think of one. No.
No, I really can't.
Because I'm just running through them in my head, and I'm thinking they were either, there was a bit of acrimony going on, or there was just no one there, like in the case of Eric Saywood having walked out, and Cartmell comes in to a locked desk, and when he finally opens it up, there's an old wine glass, a broken wine glass, I think, in the drawer with some dried up red wine in it. And yeah, I can't think of one at all that was better than this. This was fantastic, actually, this handover. So
many stories of producers or script editors coming in and just going, the cupboard was literally bare. Yet Hinchcliffe and Holmes come in, and Dicks and Letts, they've cast Liz Sladen's continuing, they've cast Tom, they've cast Ian. Terrance has written the first story for them. He's commissioned John Lucarotti and Terry Nation and Jerry Davis, and commissioned 3 or 4 stories to get them going with Daleks and Cybermen and all that excitement stuff. And I think in some ways Holmes resented a little bit that he was left almost too much. And he's like, hang on, when do I get to make a decision about this stuff? But that whole Tom Baker era, like season 12, is shaped by Terrance Dicks.
Yeah, look, and I think if they didn't do that, Holmes might have been crying in the opposite direction, like, oh, they've left me with nothing. So I think they did the right thing by doing this.
Well, they do, and I think that's what leaves Robert Holmes the time and space to do something like The Ark in Space, which John Lucarotti's scripts just completely didn't work, and he had to rewrite them basically from scratch, and he writes a masterpiece. Could he have done that if he was sitting there, working the phones going, anybody will write a Doctor Who story this year? Anybody.
Exactly.
Now, this is about the time when Terrance starts to get into doing stuff off screen as well. Now, we'll talk properly about his target novels as their own thing shortly, but the first target novel written by Terrance Dicks is Doctor Who and the Automaton Invasion, and that is published in January of 74. And in fact, he has 2 more stories in 74, and then he has 4 more stories published in 75. So he does transition very seamlessly from script editing Who to writing books.
Yes.
But he also writes some non-fiction books in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many old school fans have very fond memories of the making of Doctor Who in particular, which has 2 different covers. There's a Pertwee cover and a Baker cover,
Yes.
if you're familiar with them. The Pertwee one's worth quite a pretty penny these days, Dave.
It is. But again, laying down in black and white Doctor Who lore.
Exactly. And I mean, we should say these are the kind of books that have never been seen before. I think for the 10th anniversary, the Radio Times did a bit of a Doctor Who special, which had commentary on Doctor Who as a show and such, but there weren't at the time lots of what you would call reference books or books that weren't novelisations of stories and things. They were very thin on the ground. Of course, there's no internet either. There's not really fanzines at this point. They're probably coming in the next few years, later in the Baker era.
Yeah.
There's just sort of no information on Doctor Who for the people at home, So this is quite a big thing, this making of Doctor Who book.
Yeah, and then a few years later, he does one of my most fondly remembered books from my childhood, and that's Canine and Other Mechanical Creatures. Did you have that one, Rob?
I never had that one, Dave.
It was at the school library, and eventually I got a copy myself. I can't remember where, but I used to borrow it, once a week almost from the school library, and it was just all about Daleks and Cybermen and servo robots and quarks and Canine and just all these things that as a young boy just excite the imagination. And Terrance Dicks knew exactly what excited the young imagination, and he really tapped into that so much.
I need to get my hands on one. I think I'd really enjoy it, actually.
Yeah, it's just a lovely little piece. And looking at it now, it's so simple and so innocent. But it was just robots. Cool Doctor Who robots.
And some might argue that's what Doctor Who should be again. But I digress.
Yes. One of the things that really staggers me about Terrance Dicks is when I realise he didn't write any scripts with his name on it in the Pertwee era.
That is interesting, actually. I'm just trying to think. Let's put his name on at least a script or 2, didn't he?
He wrote under...
The Demons?
Well, he wrote under pseudonyms.
Oh, that's right.
Guy Leopold and all that sort of thing. He co-wrote The Demons and Time Monster and Planet of the Spiders, definitely. And he had a role in The Green Death as well, I think.
Yes.
But no, I don't think with his name on the credits.
No, so you're quite right. Yeah.
And that's interesting because you think of Dicks as being this prolific writer, but, well, after the War Games, there actually isn't a story with his name on the credits until Robot.
Absolutely. And, of course, Brandon Morbius with a pseudonym.
Yes, with a suitably bland pseudonym. Again, the other famous story about him wanting to take his name off it, which I've always thought it says something about his professionalism, that he'd done the job and he knew that when a producer says the script isn't working, change it, and the script editor just has to do it, he sort of got that, look, I get what Robert Holmes is doing and I don't like it, I think my version of the script was better, but that's his job, I'm getting paid a check, go away and do it. But I often wonder how much of Morbius is Terrance and how much of it is Robert Holmes.
Well, we've got to assume it's mostly Holmes for him to want his name off it. That's what I've always assumed.
Yeah. I still think a lot of the setup is probably him, and probably a certain amount of part 1 is him, but yeah, there's not a lot of Terrance left in there.
Isn't it interesting, though, he was quite happy to be script edited by a writer he had previously brought on board, whereas in the modern era, Russell didn't want to write under Stephen. and it seems unlikely Stephen or Russell will write under our new boy Chris.
Yeah, I think it is a reflection of just the relationships that they had as individuals. I mean, I've never heard anybody in a tell-all interview criticise Terrance Dicks.
No.
And clearly, as I said, he and Barry Letts were lifetime friends. He and Robert Holmes were clearly lifetime friends as long as Robert Holmes lived. He got on very well with Eric Saywood, for example. He got on very well with John Nathan Turner, and he didn't get on very well, but I think there were other issues at play there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's worth probably talking at this point, Dave, about the concept of Dicks as a Tory, because that's where people might have disagreements with him. But certainly, no one sort of slags him off, as far as I can see. No,
and look, he was very open that he was somebody who was born in a particular age, and he served in the war, and his family had spent some time as administrators in India, and he came from very not ideologically right wing stuff, but just very establishment. We don't need to change anything. We can just sort of sit here and all get along. Sort of Toryism, that one nation Toryism. And certainly he's very open about that and his views on that. But it was balanced, I think, by the very small L liberal views of Barry Letts.
Yes.
And the two of them sort of worked together very, very well. And even then, though, Terrance knew which way the wind was blowing, and he'd say, okay, well, the audience wants stronger female characters. That's cool. I'll write some stronger female characters. I'll go and invent Sarah Jane Smith, who's a plucky journalist who knows all about feminism and women's lib. And look, he doesn't always get it right. Yeah. but he's not sitting there going, I'm just going to write, I'm just going to write more women who can be peril monkeys. And as he says, their job is to be chained to the train tracks by the villain. He says, okay, we need stronger women. I'll go out there and I'll give you stronger women. And Sarah Jane Smith is a stronger woman than Katie Manning, who herself, Jo Grant, was not helpless either.
No, not at all. She was a field agent.
Exactly. So, that would all come into it. And he, said, he disagreed, for example, with Bob Baker and Dave Martin about, their views on colonialism when they were writing The Mutants, but he didn't get in the way. He just said, right, let's temper this and make sure that we're not lecturing the audience. We've got message in there and we've got content in there, but at the end of the day, are we putting out a good, fun adventure that will make people tune in next week?
We need Uncle Terrance leaning over Chris Chibnall's shoulder, I think, Dave.
But he does get to write some stories for the Fourth Doctor. We mentioned Robot, which I really enjoy.
Yes.
Horror of Fang Rock, State of Decay. Great scripts.
Oh, I mean, Horror of Fang Rock, I think if we don't talk about this for a little while, Rob from 42 to Doomsday will spontaneously combust out there at his joint. So let's talk about that for a moment. I find very few people who don't like that story.
No, likewise. And many of them will have it right up there very high on their list. And some, I've heard people refer to it as being template Doctor Who.
And how many people die in it, Dave? Talking of death counts and things?
Everybody.
And again, a very successful story. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's this idea of just taking an experienced writer who, understands Doctor Who lore, but hasn't worked in the office for some years, and saying, I want a story, I want it on a lighthouse, go.
Yeah.
And just letting this guy create characters, Skinsale and Lady Adelaide and Palmerston, really memorable characters that you recognise. And this is what the best writers do. We've said this often. You recognise their characters in a few lines, in a few sentences. You instantly know what sort of person Lord Palmerdale is. You instantly know what sort of person Reuben is.
To me, the characters in Fang Rock are very Holmesian. Like, if I didn't know who wrote Horror of Fang Rock, I'd assume it was a Robert Holmes script. Like, it might not have the flowery language in places, but the characters are so strong. It just feels Holmesian to me. Yeah,
I agree with that. It is a really lovely work. And let's be honest as well, it's when you get Terrance Dicks written and script edited by Holmes, or vice versa, that's a pretty good pair of minds to be working on any script.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why I think it is a shame that we don't get more of it today. I mean, imagine a RTD story script edited by Stephen Moffat. I mean, we got Stephen Moffat script edited by RTD, and they were generally fantastic.
Yes. And I think it would be the same in reverse.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think there should be more of it. And something that I think leads us from Horror of Fang Rock into State of Decay is that Terrance is also, in my opinion, very across this idea that it should be not educational in a lecturing way, but young children watching Doctor Who should walk away with an appreciation of something, whether it's a person from history or a time in history or a concept or an idea. And you see that in Horror of Fang Rock. He talks about the turn of the century and the change from gas to electricity and how that was. State of Decay, you get stuff about the continental shift and vampire stuff. In the Time Warrior, he talks. He's talking about, not in a really accurate way, but knights and castles and all that sort of thing in Crusades. There's always that little, again, what he calls the boys' book of that thing that would inspire young people watching the series.
Yeah, there's always a point to it. And, I don't want to belabour the most recent series of Doctor Who too much, but you look at some of those stories, you think, well, what was the actual point of that story? What did I learn? Some of them you learned quite a bit. Some of them were wonderful, but others, I'm not so sure.
And the first group, I think we both said, were the most successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, are you a fan of State of Decay, Rob?
I don't mind it. I've never been hugely into it, which is interesting, because I do like vampires, I do like darker stories, I like the gothic stuff. It has a lot of ingredients that should appeal to me. I like the stories of the Time Lords fighting the great vampires and all that. It's not quite a classic for me, though, and I've never been able to put my finger on it. Maybe we should look at it in detail one day. Maybe I should rewatch it or something, and we can talk about it. But
well, when the Series 18 Blu-ray comes out.
Could be a perfect time.
Yeah. One other script for the CV show he did write, Rob, that we have to mention.
Yes, please.
Well, do you want to take us through this, because it is your Doctor?
It is my Doctor. It is the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors. Oh, Dave, this is... I've said this before. This is putting on an old pair of slippers and just enjoying Doctor Who. I mean, when people think of Day of the Doctor and how that celebrated the 50th anniversary, yes, absolutely, wonderful story, but this is different. This is a simpler story. It's just a beautiful thing. And I don't know if it's because of the age I watched it at. I was a contemporary of the episode. I was a young child at the time I saw it and such. But, I could watch Five Doctors every day of the week and not get bored of it, Dave. I really could.
Look, I'm absolutely the same. And again, part of it is because it was such a big part of my childhood. But part of it is, as you said, it just works so well. It is so lovely. And Terrance gets all of the characters right. There's no moment where you think, that Doctor wasn't like this. And okay, some of them are a little bit caricatured because they need to be quickly in the story and they need to sell what they do, and the companions all get a little bit to do and they all get to bond. And all the little references, the Liz Shaw moment, the Captain Yates moment, the stuff with Jamie and Zoe is really good. And it's the little lines he puts in, just that casual John Pertwee, well, I've reversed the polarity of the neutron flow so the TARDIS will be free of the force field, or that lovely moment where the Master's about to threaten the Doctor and the Brigadier's taps on the shoulder. Nice to see you again. Wallop.
It's just great.
It is. And I'm so glad that he got to write that. It is such a celebration.
And we should say he only got to write it because Robert Holmes couldn't.
Yes.
Which is very interesting. We've just been praising them both and, aren't they brilliant? Robert Holmes really struggled with it and Terrance had to step in.
Yeah, and I think that as much as I love Robert Holmes, I think that was for the better. This is absolutely something that Terrance Dicks was built for. Yeah,
I think the way Holmes writes, he might have tried to push the boat out a bit too far and it just might have fallen into a screaming heap, whereas Terrance plays it a bit lighter and it just works better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Robert Holmes was really going for a story in its own right that happened to have 5 Doctors in it, or in his case 6, and Terrance Dicks just said, okay, I'm just going to have fun. Let's see the first Doctor, Susan, and a Dalek. Let's see Pertwee being menaced by some Cybermen. Let's put in a Rastor Warrior robot. Let's have a Yeti for 2 minutes because, hey, let's just have a Yeti, That's what makes it really fun.
Yeah. Oh, it's just brilliant. The whole concept of the death zone on Gallifrey, just being able to bring all these bonkers things together in the same space. Genius.
Yep, and a script that is written with such just light-hearted joy.
Yeah, fantastic.
And that ends with that moment. I still get, a lump in my throat when I watch Dave just turn around and do the, when Tegan's doing the whole, so you're just going to go on the run from your own people in a rackety old TARDIS? Why not? After all, that's how it all started.
Yeah. And then the music.
Yeah. It is so good.
Yes. Okay. I might need a cigarette after that, Dave.
Well, if we're talking nostalgia, let's keep going because we need to talk Target books. In fact, we need to talk, if you count junior editions, we need to talk 65 Target books.
Yes, and look, we mentioned him writing these starting off in the mid-70s, and pretty soon he started to basically manage the range. I think, though, this was an unofficial sort of thing. He wasn't the official manager, but he just sort of fell into doing it. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, very, very much so. He calls himself the uncredited unofficial manager, in that the company would say, okay, we've got the rights to these. And he would say, okay, well, look, I know the writer of that one, so I'll ring him and say, hey, do you want to novelise The Abominable Snowman? No, cool, I'll do it. Or, hey, hey, Don Horton, do you want to go novelise one of your stories? Or, hey, Mac Hulk, do you want to do the Silurians for us? Absolutely, here you go. Somebody else doesn't? Cool, I'll do it. So a lot of the ones he does are the Robert Holmes stories, because obviously, famously, Robert Holmes only wrote one and a bit Target novels. His first work is The Auton Invasion in 1974. He then does Day of the Daleks and The Abominable Snowman. 3 very good books. He then kicks on. He does 4 more in 75. The first of them being one of his own, Giant Robot, but he's then into Pertwee stories that he script edited, so 3 Doctors, Planet of Spiders, Terror of the Autons. And it's then that he starts to really churn them all out. He does a heap in 76. He starts to really get to novelising a lot of the Pertwees and the Tom Bakers in 77. Not so much in 78, 79. I think he had other work there. In 1980, he writes 10 books, or at least has 10 books published in 1980. And I think when people talk about the Terrance just churning them out books, that's the era we're talking about. And in there you've got stuff like The Invasion of Time, most of the Key to Time series, Horns of Nimon, and look, famously, Destiny of the Daleks, which a friend of mine once described as a book you could finish on a trip to the gents.
Very true.
Yep.
And look, we should say this isn't Terrance's fault. I mean, the publisher wants these out. The original writers don't want to do it. Terrance knows the format and knows he can bang it out better than anyone else, so he just does it.
Yeah, they're not bad books. And when you actually go back and read them, often they do have lots of just tiny things in there that you didn't realise. People remember the prologue and the epilogue of Pyramids of Mars, for example, and they're really good. There's a prologue I had forgotten in Horns of Nimon.
Is there really?
Yeah, there's this 3-page prologue where it talks about Skonos and the Civil War's ended and all that's left is the military and a few scientists, and then this strange ship lands and Soldeed sort of found as this lab technician going, oh, you go in there and check it out, and he comes out with the staff and says, I've spoken with the Nimon, and it all sort of goes from there. Like little things like that. I read Invisible Enemy a year ago, and in that, just in the opening chapters, there's all this stuff about how the new Earth Empire works and how it was expanding, and it was expected if you were going to be a space astronaut, you had to do 3 months at a station on Titan just to, because that's part of your job. Just little details. These are not bad books. They're light and they're quick.
Yeah. But
there's still love in them.
Yeah. Oh, of course. He is a professional. He just had to churn them out quickly. Yeah,
and something like An Unearthly Child. I mean, that's the only book he turns out in 1981, and that's a really good book. And then he starts to do, Inferno's 84. That's a really good book.
Oh, look, that's one of the ones I remember borrowing from the library, and the cover, so evocative.
Yeah.
With the guy transformed there in his white lab coat, and oh, gosh, yeah.
Yeah, and as we sort of get past about 1983, 84, they get better and better. Warriors of the Deep, a really good book. Caves of Androzani. Mind of Evil, really good. Time Monster, for a story that's a bit up and down, a great novelisation. And then he just starts to bring them home. Ambassadors of Death, Seeds of Death, Will in Space, Space Pirates. I reckon they are all fantastically good novels.
Well, I was just going to say, with regard to Time Monster, I read that long before I saw the episode. And I'd heard people say, oh, that's a terrible story. My only experience of it was the novel. I was thinking, what are you talking about? That's a cracking story. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, some of these novels are far better, remember, than the TV stories were. And he took the charm, and I'm sure he loved this, to not have to worry about budget. So Omega's Palace is this wonderful, huge palatial thing with this huge singularity flame. It's not a very small set with a bit of pissy smoke rising up from it.
Like a humidifier or something. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and he does that. Look, I've defended the Space Pirates before, but I get that it's not a great story. The book is really, really good. The Wheel in Space is really, really good.
And really, really expensive now.
That is true. That is true.
It's mega expensive. Don't even bother looking for it, people. It's incredibly expensive.
So, yeah, I mean, he churned out 65 books in 16 years.
And that's on top of, again, people go and look him up on Wikipedia, all the other stuff he was actually doing at that time, script editing for TV and writing other things, you know.
Producing the classic serial, writing other children's books.
Yeah,
just amazing stuff. But it doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
He goes on. I mean, during the Wilderness years, he continues to be associated with Doctor Who. When they get around to doing the Virgin New Adventures, he writes the second one of them, still in my opinion one of the best, Time Worm Exodus. That's a fantastic book. He writes Blood Harvest, a really good book, and one where famously he has a bit of fun occasionally at some of his own little tropes, which we maybe need to talk about, because there is that wonderful bit, oft quoted, where the police sergeant is telling the police inspector about how this blue box suddenly disappeared with a sort of a wheezing, groaning sound. And the inspector says, what sort of idiot would come up with a description like that?
That's great.
But yeah, I mean, these phrases that we remember, the wheezing, groaning sound.
Yes.
Do you remember what sort of face Peter Davison had, Rob?
Pleasant and open, I believe, Dave.
Pleasant and open face, yes. We all know that John Pertwee had a shock of white hair.
Yeah.
You know, that most mysterious traveller through time, known as the Doctor.
For people of a certain age, because I don't know how many people read Target novels these days, Dave, which is a great shame. These phrases are just burned into your cortex, you know?
There's something really familiar and safe when I think back to those opening pages of any Terrance Dicks novel that just started in a familiar way with language and phrases that we all come to expect. It really is quite wonderful and heavily nostalgic.
Now, before we move to his work with the BBC books, was there anything else you wanted to say about the Virgin books?
Simply that at the time when Exodus particularly came out, I think Terrance's reputation wasn't as strong then as it is now, because a lot of people did sort of see him as being the guy who just churned out he said, she said novels, and they didn't really appreciate some of his latter and earlier work. He wasn't knocked, but he wasn't seen as being the best author. And then suddenly it's like he delivers Exodus. He's been told, you have no budget, no constraints, no page count limit, write a story. And he creates this wonderful story that spans across time zones and parts of Earth's history, and Nuremberg rallies and World War II and zombies and nuclear explosions and stuff that you could never do. I mean, even with a $10 million budget, you couldn't make that episode. And he does it. Blood Harvest again. He goes from bootlegger 1930s Chicago to the Planet of the Vampires. There's stuff on Gallifrey, huge cast, huge ideas, and just wonderful stuff. But you mentioned Shakedown. Of course, we need to mention he was the scriptwriter for one of those semi-professional, semi-amateur productions that was made during the Wilderness years. And Shakedown came out in 94 from memory, and I'm really fond of that. It was an adventure set in the Doctor Who universe with no Doctor, but there were the Sontarans, there was a Rutan. It had Carol Ann Ford in it. It had Sophie Aldred in it. Jan Chaplin and Brian Croucher from Blake Seven were in it. Michael Wisher was in it. And just this lovely, wonderful story that Terrance wrote, and that he then turned into the middle third of a Virgin New Adventure.
Oh, great stuff.
But it doesn't stop there.
It doesn't stop there, Dave. No, he moves on to the BBC books, where he writes far more than for the Virgin books, because the BBC books were the 8th Doctor adventures rather than the adventures of the 7th Doctor. Plus, they also did what are called Past Doctor adventures, which I guess in the Virgin range were the missing adventures.
Yes.
Under the Past Doctor adventures, Dicks did 5 in total. He did Catastrophia, Players, Warmonger, Deadly Reunion, which was a team-up with Barry Letts on that novel, and World Game. And for the 8th Doctor range, what you would call the main range, he did its first novel, The 8 Doctors, and another one called Endgame, which used characters from the Past Doctor adventure Players. So he was even tying together these new adversaries he created in players and tying them into later stories in the Eighth Doctor range, and still doing really creative stuff. The Eight Doctors, though, I'll concentrate on, because that gets kicked around a lot. It is very basic, but to me, if you filmed this, it would be akin to the Five Doctors, because it's the Eighth Doctor sort of zipping through, falling into adventures from the previous 7 Doctors, and, interacting with himself, and it's just wonderful. It's hokey, but Five Doctors is hokey, but it's fun and it's comfortable. I find the Eight Doctors novel very fun and comfortable too, but it's not a great story. There's a difference. Yeah,
I think it's really worth noting that when they came to launch this book range in 1999, I think the Eight Doctors comes out, certainly 88, 89, that period, they get a guy who started his work on the show in 1969, who's for a time was just known as that guy that does 124 pages of he said, she said, and churns them out, and now they're going, who do we get to launch our entire range? That guy. We're getting Terrance Dicks.
Yeah, well, why not?
Yeah, and I agree. I remember reading The Eight Doctors and thinking, okay, it's a little bit, as you say, it's a little bit hokey, but it was a fun adventure, and I kind of enjoyed the nostalgia, and he was kind of getting us all up to date and getting everybody on the same page. And then I realised that everybody else hated it, and I was like, really? That's like kicking a puppy.
Yeah, it's like the other authors looked at it and thought, yeah, okay, we're just going to do our own thing from here. And that was a shame.
Yeah, look, it has its place, it did its job, and I think it was very deliberate to have that light, easy, accessible 8 Doctors, and then they had Kate Orman and John Blum do the Vampire one. Was it Vampire Science, I think it's called?
Yeah, Vampire Science, which is a great book.
Yeah, which is a great book. But they're very, one's very trad and one's very rad, and that gives you a very good introduction to the range.
Yeah, it's chalk and cheese stuff, really, but hey, that's what makes Doctor Who interesting sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. But he doesn't finish there.
No, Dave. What does he do next?
He novelises the Sarah Jane Adventures opener, The Invasion of the Bane. Mm-hmm. He writes 2 of the new series quick read novellas for, I think it's for the Matt Smith Doctor. So again, this is somebody who has written in one way or another for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th, and 11th Doctors at least.
Yeah, the ones you're thinking of there are Made of Steel, which was 2007, and Revenge of the Jadoon in 2008. And doesn't that blow your mind? Terrance Dicks is writing about the Jadoon.
Yeah.
They seem like eras that are so separate, like nothing links those 2 eras, where Dicks was writing and the Jadoon. But no, he's written a novel about the Jadoon. Well, a quick read novel at least. Yeah, and it's interesting that he has done that, because I wanted to mention quickly the reaction he and Barry Letts had to the telly movie in 96, where they famously... Now, it's not quite clear whether they sort of, walked out halfway through in protest or, the moment the credits started, they were like, we're out of here, that was terrible. But they certainly walked out very unhappy with what was done in that. There was a sort of a view that, they'd had their day and they didn't want to modernise. But no, when given the chance to work on something they do enjoy, Terrance is very happy to go and work on new era stuff. Yeah. It's a shame that this finished about 10 years ago now, that Jadoon book, because he's still competent. I think he could still be writing now for the series, little things like that perhaps, or even stories in the annuals or things.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to see that. I guess it's getting a bit late in his career now. Yes.
Now, which brings me to the personal, because I have met Terrance. He came to a convention a few years ago now in Australia, and it was kind of wonderful to see him. And he was everything you would expect. There was a lovely moment. I was sitting in the audience, and the panel was on before me, and then they sort of changed over, and they had this format where Gary Russell was going to interview Terrance Dicks, and Gary was on stage, and the con manager was sort of starting to get everything done. And before that, Terrance Dicks had just quietly come into the auditorium and sat a couple rows behind me, and he was just sitting there, and one of the minders, just a little sort of 20-year-old minder, the people with volunteers you get at these conventions, went up to him while this was all happening and said, Mr. Dicks, you can go on the stage now. And Terrance said to him and said, I will go up when I am announced. There is no rush.
What a gentleman.
Yeah, I just thought this is it. This is the guy we've all come to see. And he told his old stories and he told his anecdotes. He talked about working in the Troughton era, and he talked about working with different people. He talked about how he watched the new series when he could. He liked a lot of it. He didn't like some of it. There was a bit where he said, I hear they've just turned the Master into a woman. Oh, I don't like that. And Gary Russell said, oh, come on, Terrance, don't you think in this day of age, why shouldn't the Master be a woman? And Terrance said, there's no reason, I just don't like it.
I think we all have relatives like Terrance.
I think we do. But he did get the question, as they always do, what's your favourite story? And rather than equivocating or doing what most people do and say, I love them all, he actually gave us his top 3.
Oh, do you remember them?
I do, and it was interesting why he picked them. He said, look, I can't give you a favourite, but I can give you 3 that mean a lot to me. Mm-hmm. The first is the War Games. He said, for something that he and Malcolm Hulke just churned out in desperation, for it to be so well regarded so many years later, he just said that makes him really proud. Mm-hmm. He said Robot. Yeah. Because when he says, when I get to think about the fact that I wrote the first Tom Baker story and created the Fourth Doctor's character and set him all up, and what a wonderful success and popular Doctor he was, he said, I feel really proud that I started that.
Oh, bless.
And he says the Five Doctors, for all the reasons we talked about. He says he just really enjoyed writing that, and what could have been a mess and what could have been a disaster, he feels, he's really proud that he thinks, was a really lovely story that we regard. So they were his favourites.
Oh, that's lovely. You know what we should do in a minute? We should do our own top 3 or top 5 Terrance stories to see how we correspond with that.
Oh, good idea. But look, finally I did go up and get an autograph from him, and I've met a lot of Doctor Who actors now. I've met several doctors and a lot of companions and everything, but I've never been more starstruck than standing in front of Terrance Dicks asking him for an autograph.
Yeah.
And just thinking how much of my childhood and how much of the best parts and the fondest memories of my childhood were written by this man.
Yeah.
And I was just absolutely in awe of just having Terrance Dicks in front of me. I can just remember when I was again at primary school, and you'd go to the primary school library, and I didn't know how, libraries were laid out or anything, but I went to the D's for Doctor Who, and there was just a whole bunch of Doctor Who novels. Now, I now know it's because they were under D for Dicks.
Yes.
But I just thought, I want Doctor Who, I'll go to the D section, and there were just all these books that I borrowed and read and loved.
Oh, it's lovely. Did you take a target novel, or did you take that copy of Time Frame that you get everyone to sign?
I took the Time Frame that I got everyone to sign. So yes.
Ah, okay. I was going to say, because it'd be very hard to choose a target novel to take.
Yeah, that was a problem as well. And look, back in the days when conventions, your entry ticket got you 3 free autographs, I would have done the Time Frame and 2 books, but in the age when you've got to pay serious money just for one autograph, it had to be one, sadly. But it's not about the autograph, is it? It's about the moment.
Yeah.
And that was a really special moment, meeting Terrance Dicks.
Did you get to say anything to him? Like, you meant a lot to me? Or
I did. I was sort of looking for one of those, words that I could say that sort of, I'm not a really sad loser fan. I've got really intelligent, insightful things to say. And no, and I just said, look, thank you. I've really enjoyed everything you've written. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's the simplest thing to say, and it's the best, I think.
Yeah, and what a good life to have led, that even when you're, pushing into your 80s, for people to come up and go, thank you for making my childhood a happier thing.
Exactly.
Teaching people to read. I mean, the first proper long-form novel that I ever read was The Dalek Invasion of Earth.
Yeah, so many great memories. I don't know what I'd say to him, but I think it would be something similar to that, just something simple, and, he's probably heard it a million times before, but you just need to say something.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was a wonderful moment. One of my favourite fandom moments.
So, that idea, Dave, our top 3 or top 5 of things Terrance has written?
Yep, so I've got a 5. Should we do them all together, or should we go back and forth?
Oh, yeah, let's go back and forth.
All right, well, we'll kick us off then, Rob.
Coming in at number 1, Dave, The Five Doctors.
Snap.
There's just no way it can't be on the list, let alone at number 1.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's my number 1 as well, The Five Doctors, for all the reasons we've already discussed.
Okie dokie.
Your number 2.
Horror of Fang Rock.
Ah, okay. It is a very good story.
Oh, Rob from 42 to Doomsday is going to murder you next time he sees you.
I know. It is a very good
Jesus.
story. It made my shortlist, but not quite my 5.
Okay.
So my number 2, Rob, I did go for Time Worm Exodus, which is just one of my favourite books, full stop, never mind favourite Doctor Who books. It is a wonderful story. It's got everything. I've read it many times over the years, probably certainly more than I've read any other Doctor Who fiction book. So, yeah, Exodus is at number 2 for me.
Fantastic. My number 3 is Brain of Morbius.
Ooh, go on.
Just one of the very, very early stories I remember, possibly through BBC Video back in the 80s. And I can't even remember if it was the horribly edited version or not. Who knows? But it was great anyway. It was just this wonderfully dark, gothic, scary story to me. And I thought it was wonderful. Just wonderful. And I know his name's technically not on it, but you know what I mean.
I do. My number 3 is one that I know won't be a snap roll because of what you've said earlier, and that is State of Decay.
Yeah, not a classic for me, but a good story.
Yeah, I really like it. I like the characters. I like the gothic feel of it. I love the way that the Doctor and Romana worked so well together. I think he writes those characters probably better than almost anybody else. Yeah, I just have a huge fondness and respect for State of Decay. I think it's one of the best things he wrote.
Okay. My number 4, I'm going really left field here. The BBC Past Doctor Adventure Players.
Oh, I don't know that one. Tell me about it.
Okay. Well, I thought you might ask that, so I actually grabbed the blurb because it's been a while since I had read it, and I could have said, look, it's the 6th Doctor and it's Winston Churchill and the Boer War, and that's about all I remember. But the actual blurb runs like this, Dave. Arriving on the sun-baked veldt in the middle of the Boer War, the 6th Doctor is involved in the adventures of a struggling politician and war correspondent, Winston Churchill. Of course, he knows Churchill is destined for great things, but unseen forces seem to be interfering with Winston's historic career. The Doctor suspects the hidden hand of the Players, mysterious beings who regard human history as little more than a game. With time running out, can the Doctor find the right moves to defeat them?
Interesting. I need to check that one out.
And then that's what I was mentioning earlier. The Players do come back in the 8th Doctor story Endgame as well. So he sort of ties them into a later story too.
Oh, okay. I hadn't even heard of that one. Oh, thank you for that.
No, it's good fun. And I know you like Churchill, so there you go.
Yeah. I'm going left field a bit with my number 4 as well. And I'm cheating a little bit because I'm going to have both Shakedown, the telemovie, and the New Adventure. This is, look, Shakedown is not the best work of literature. Certainly the movie isn't. And, you know, it and the book are just, again, really enjoyable. It's Terrance taking out the Doctor Who toy box and just having a lot of fun with it. Fun with the Sontarans and with the Rutans, you know, with the Galactic Federation. He really gets McCoy's Doctor. Again, he finds that balance between the impish McCoy and the dark Dr. McCoy and just writes him really, really well. He gets Benny Summerfield really, really well. I just think that's a really fun book. And although the telemovie isn't perfect, and in fact is a little bit trite at times, I just love it to death.
Yeah. Coming in at number 5 for me, this sort of bookends with my first pick being the 5 Doctors, and I'm going to throw in the 8th Doctor Adventure, the 8 Doctors, because it does get panned so much, but I'm going to put it on my top 5 list here because it is such fun, and it does bookend nicely with 5 Doctors. It's just Terrance being Terrance. I appreciate when you say, you know, he came along in the Virgin Adventures and wrote things like Exodus, and that's amazing, shows what an author he can be. 8th Doctors is maybe a regression in some people's eyes, but it's a fun regression, and I love it.
No, I'm glad you picked that. I think it does deserve more love than it gets. For my number 5 pick, I wanted to go with a Target novel. I had a few options: Invasion of the Daleks, Space Pirates, Ambassadors of Death, but I'm going with his novelisation of The Wheel in Space. Because I remember reading that as a kid and then rereading it as an adult and finding the same thing, but as a kid it was so evocative. He has a slightly longer page count with that one, so he takes the time to talk about the space program, and there's the adventures on the Silver Carrier and the servo robot. He gets the creepiness of the Cybermen really well. He gets the characters really well. He just takes a story that, look, I like, but I get it's not the best Doctor Who story, and it's not the best Cyberman story, but I like it. But he takes an average okay story and just plays with it in such a fun and effective way. And that's what he does in a lot of his later Doctor Who novels. I mean, the fact that he can make the space pirates, which, look, I like it more than other people, but again, I understand it's not a brilliant story. He takes that to a whole new level. You know, when he gets the chance, he really does a lot with these books. And so, yeah, Will in Space for me.
Lovely. And look, a runner-up for me would have been the Target novel, The Time Monster, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. It just made a story that everyone seems to hate seem wonderful to me. I couldn't figure out what anyone was on about.
Yeah, look, it's a really mixed list that we've come out with there, and we've just scraped the surface. It was so hard trying to get that down to 5. But what a wonderful contribution. And look, we've just had so much fun talking about it tonight.
Oh, well, it's Uncle Terrance. How are we not going to talk this long?
How do you not cover 50 years of involvement in a show?
Exactly.